Hi everybody, my name's Emma Parnell and I am head of design of a company called Joy. Joy is a company I really recently launched, and we combine brand development with service design to ensure that customers can get their needs met and companies can deliver on their promises. Before setting up Joy, I worked as a service design lead at NHS Digital. I worked in the bit of the organisation called Citizen Health Tech, and we designed and delivered citizen-facing products and services. As part of my time there, I worked on the service that allowed people to book an appointment for a COVID-19 vaccination. And as part of that work, I faced a challenge around sex and gender, which is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So before I tell you the story of what happened, I want to set a little bit of context. So most of you here will probably know this, but I think it's a really good reminder to remind ourselves of the difference between sex and gender and the fact that these things are not the same. So when it comes to sex, we're talking about the biological aspects of an individual determined by their anatomy. The terms usually used are male or female, and this is something that is assigned at birth. Whereas gender is a social construct. It relates to behaviours, attitudes, and labels of masculinity and femininity. A person's gender may not be binary. They may identify along a spectrum. And importantly, somebody's gender may not match the sex that they were assigned at birth. So the reason I start by talking about this is that the work that we did and the problem we faced, something that underpinned that was that sex and gender were being conflated. So as I said previously, it's important to remember that they are not the same thing. So another bit of context I like to include when I tell this story is about the fact that sadly, we're not living in a society where everybody is treated equally at the moment. The trans population especially are facing a really difficult time with the rise of transphobia. People are really struggling. I'm not going to read all of these stats out that are on the screen, but they begin to paint a picture for you of the struggles that people are having. The stats I'm about to show are taken from Stonewall's LGBT in Britain report that came out a couple of years ago. And the reason I talk about this is when we work in government on services, often people bring stats up like what is on the screen, a stat that says that around 1% of the population might identify as trans or non-binary. And people can dismiss that. People can say 1% is really small. You know, we don't have to worry about those people. But, you know, in the case of national scale services, this could equate to hundreds of thousands of people. And even if it didn't equate to hundreds of thousands of people, each one of those people is a person with a family and a story and feelings, and they are important. So as I said, people are suffering. People are experiencing hate crime because of their gender. People are experiencing homelessness. These are really sad statistics to have to put on the screen, but it's the reality of what is happening to people right now. And it's especially hard for people in healthcare. Almost half of trans people say that healthcare staff lack understanding of specific trans health needs when they're attempting to access the healthcare that they need. And one of the main reasons why I want to highlight this is that my dad is trans. My dad is one of those 600,000 plus people, one of the people who has a family and a story and feelings. And when you're designing for that 1%, I want you to think of the humans behind those figures. So coming to the story, this was a piece of work that we did as part of the work to design the national booking service for coronavirus vaccinations, as I said. So this is a service that is still live now. If you haven't booked or had 1 or 2 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine, you can access it via the NHS website and you can book your appointments. And this is a service I worked as part of the team to do the initial design and delivery of towards the back end of last year, so kind of September through to December last year before it launched. And as part of that work, we found out that we faced a problem, and this became apparent to us only maybe kind of 2-3 weeks before the initial go live date of the service. And we found out that we might have to ask people about their gender while accessing this service. And I was very keen to understand why we had to ask somebody that when all they were doing was booking an appointment. And if you've used the service, you'll know that there are 2 routes into the service, basically. We need to identify you when you're coming in to book that appointment. And to do that, we connect to an infrastructure service called the Personal Demographic Service. That's another service used by and delivered by NHS Digital. It's known as PDS. And we look someone up on that database. It's basically the database that holds the NHS numbers. We look someone up on that either by you entering your NHS number or by entering a series of demographic details about yourself. And we know from research that not everybody knows their NHS number. So we had to build a second route for people to enter a series of demographic details about themselves. We could find you that way. We found out kind of at the final hour, as I said, that one of those details would need to be gender. And the reason why was because it was a mandatory field in the matching process for the API. So an API connects one system to another, and it had built in a mandatory requirement for gender in that matching process. This was problematic. As I said, we were not asking for clinical or monitoring purposes. We just wanted to let someone book an appointment. So this is not something we need to know about somebody at that particular point in their vaccination journey. Another problem was that the data we had to play with was not particularly inclusive. So the data held on PDS is labeled gender, but the attributes held talk to somebody's sex. So there are 4 attributes on PDS, male, female, unspecified, and unknown. As you can imagine, the last 2 are not particularly helpful. So these things combined made it very difficult to design an inclusive front-end screen for this service. So to start with, we wanted to explore whether there was a technical solution that we could implement, something we could do kind of under the hood, if you like, to ensure that we didn't have to ask the question in the first instance. And this was a point where I worked very closely with our technical architects, so design and technical architecture working in really close collaboration to look at options. And we knew that other services had faced this challenge in the past, and previously one of the things they'd done was the API would basically do 4 calls. So it would look for people until they found them. And this was something other services had done, but our service was very high profile at the time. We were unsure how people were going to use it. We were unsure how many people would need to use it at the same time. And because of that, there was a lot of caution around performance, a lot of worries that the service would fall over if too much load was put on it. So for that reason, these solutions that we were coming up with were deemed to be too much of a performance risk. So because of that, we accepted that we would have to ask the question. So we worked as a real multidisciplinary team on the design of the screen. We knew this wouldn't be the first time someone had faced this, so we drew on existing knowledge and research from inside and outside of the NHS. We worked very closely with the LGBT health team in NHS England. They advised us throughout and gave us brilliant advice. And our content community especially had faced challenges like this in the past and had existing experience that we could draw on. So with this in mind, we designed what we felt was quite an inclusive solution to begin with, and we then wanted to put that into research. So we worked with our user researchers to recruit trans and non-binary people to do research with. We had very limited time for this. From the moment we found out to the moment we had to lock down development for go live, we had a maximum 2 weeks, I think probably less than that. So it just shows you can always make time for user research, and you always should make time for user research, especially on something as important as this. So this was the screen that we took to research. We were very specific about not using the terms sex or gender in the question because of the reason I explained at the start, because of the conflation between the two. We wanted to make sure that we explained why we're asking. This was a challenge because obviously it's kind of real reason is because we have to match to this other kind of fairly uninclusive system that we have in place, which is difficult to explain sometimes. And we offered the users 5 options. So users could choose female, male, non-binary, prefer not to say, or how I self-describe does not match my GP record. And we took this into research, and thankfully it tested pretty well. We only had the time to test with 5 people, but that is the numbers we do user research in. We test with 5, and then we iterate and we test with 5 more. And it tested really well. One of the sad things I think it made me realise was that the bar is fairly low for people in this situation. They don't expect much. So when we showed them this screen, people were actually surprised. So the quote on the screen reads, "If anything, it made me feel more like the things that are going on are being done by people who know what they're doing." Another situation that we were really keen to design for was people going through transition. We knew that in this situation, people would be well aware of what was on their GP record and may be well aware that what was on their record may not match how they currently identify. We didn't want people to face that barrier when booking an appointment. So we did the work to ensure that there would be an option for those people to select. So in this case, the quote reads, "I would click female, but in January 2018, I started male to female transition, and pretty much all my documents say I am female. But for some strange reason, my medical records still state me as male. If I was to click female, which to all intents and purposes I am, I might not match up." So as I said, the solution tested really well. We didn't make many changes off the back of the user research. I think we tweaked some of the content, but just to explain how the solution works, and this is where the collaboration between design and technical architecture was really important, because the way the screen works is if you select male or female, which a high proportion of the population will, the system does one API call and it will find you. But if you select any of the 3rd, 4th, or 5th options, so non-binary, prefer not to say, or how I self-describe my not match my GP record, that's when we do the 4 API calls. And that was allowed to go through from performance perspective because there was an assumption that there would be a smaller percentage of the population selecting those options. So that's what we launched with. The service went live in January of this year, and we were really pleased to receive some positive feedback. Not long after launch, Tash, who we worked with in the LGBT health team, kindly forwarded this quote onto me. So it reads, "Just thought I would let you know that we had an email from a non-binary person this week who was considering not accessing a vaccination due to having to select a binary gender option in their local system and the dysphoria this would cause. After pointing them in the direction of the main system and the work you had done, they got back to me to say they had managed to book one and thanking us and you for the inclusive options they could select." So this was really heartening for us. We were glad that the work we'd put into the design of the screen had paid off. We did, however, encounter some problems, and this was feedback we picked up anecdotally, actually, about what was happening in the call centre. So the system that we designed was also used by the call centre staff to book people in over the phone. So a slightly different instance of the technology with a few things removed, but for the most part, the same system. And we heard that staff were finding it uncomfortable to read the question over the phone because of the way it was worded. They found that it confused some users. At this point, the majority of the users booking appointments were older people because of the way that the age-based rollout happened. We also heard that some call centre staff were avoiding asking the question and making assumptions based on the sound of people's voices, which was fairly concerning. So there was a clear need for LGBTQ awareness training here, and a real need to design the kind of citizen-facing digital channel and the phone channel in parallel, something that we had let slip during a moment of panic and stress, I think it's fair to say. So if we were keeping the question in the service, this is something I would have pursued and looked to work with the call centre staff on to improve. However, I had bigger fish to fry, and my focus at that point was to make the case to remove it. So I actually moved off the programme when the service launched, but I was not happy that the service had gone live with this question in. And I started doing the work to build the momentum and awareness needed to make the case, basically. And the case needed to be made in two different places. Firstly, it did help that the issue kind of did end up going right to the top of the organisation. We were working on a really high profile service at the time, probably the most important thing going on in the organisation. And I was able to use this as a springboard to get people's attention around it. It then became apparent that there were two teams that needed to do the work. So the team that work on the personal demographic service, they build, maintain, develop the API. And that is where the change needed to happen in order to remove the mandatory matching aspect. But we also needed to do further development work to take the question out of the service, something that is quite hard to make the case for when you're living in a really chaotic, stressful, everything is urgent type environment like we were at the time with the booking service. So making the case to do some development work to remove something is not easy to make the case for. But, you know, always continuing to push and highlight and escalate the importance of inclusion is something we all really need to do, and something I continue to do until thankfully I was successful. So the two changes did get made. The PDS change was made first, which was great news. And then about 3 or 4 weeks later, the booking service team made the second change, which meant at that point that the question was able to be removed. So I think it was live in the booking service for about 8-9 weeks in the end. But then the most important thing, I think, with this work is that we made a change to kind of underlying infrastructure, not just the service itself. While it was great to get it removed from that service, the wider benefits were the important thing. You know, we had people from other services reaching out to us saying, oh, now you've made that change to the API, can we use that API? Can we take the question out of our service? You know, COVID-19 testing services had already faced some pressure to change the way they were asking the question from LGBT rights groups, and rightly so. So, you know, they went on a journey themselves, looking at different ways they could redesign the question. They were facing slightly different technical constraints to us at the time. We also had people reach out around the electronic staff record in the NHS. And if I had stayed in the NHS, I probably would have gone knocking on the doors of 111 online, because I know it features there as well. We also had people reach out from across government. So, you know, this was work that resonated with other parts of the system in terms of facing quite challenging technical constraints from existing infrastructure services that were, I guess, holding them back in terms of making their services as inclusive as they could be. We had a really interesting conversation with the team who were building the National Insurance Number service, for example. And I think that's the main message I want to leave people with when I tell this story, is that as a design community, as a kind of agile product development community, we're getting pretty good at designing inclusive front-end services. There's always work we can do. There's always things we can make more accessible, etc. However, we have improved a lot over the years. Where I think we need to really now turn our attention is to mounting the case for changing these outdated infrastructure systems, because they often sit under multiple services, and if those services can work together and make a collective case for why these systems are holding us back, why they're not allowing us to be as inclusive as we would like to be in the design of those front end screens, that's when we really start making the change that we want to see, in my opinion. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to contact me for anything at all, then my details are on the screen. My Instagram is Design for Joy Ltd with underscores between the words. Twitter, worddoodles_EP, and you can find my website at designforjoy.co.uk. Thank you very much for listening.